In the summer of 1990, Nintendo was months away from launching the Super Famicom, a 16-bit game console with bigger games and improved graphics and sound over its 8-bit predecessor, the Famicom, or NES, in the West. Nintendo of Japan had been working on 3 games ahead of the hardware's launch that demonstrated the power of this new console and highlighted some of its special features. Super Mario World was a graphical powerhouse for the time, adding more colors and larger sprites to Mario's newest adventure than what was possible in any of his earlier games. F-Zero was a science fiction-inspired racer that made use of the Super Famicom's ability to scale and rotate background images to make racing more realistic than ever. And finally, there was Pilotwings, a flight simulation game that pulled out all the tricks the Super NES hardware could muster to make the player feel like they were actually flying a plane. There was just one problem. Mario creator and Pilotwings producer Shigeru Miyamoto wanted to be able to display the plane in Pilotwings from any angle in true 3D. Despite the advanced hardware and unique graphic modes that could present games in pseudo-3D, true polygonal graphics that could render an object from any angle was thought to be an impossibility on the Super NES. A solution would eventually present itself, not from within Nintendo, but from a group of teenagers who dropped out of high school to make video games with cutting-edge 3D graphics at a small London-based development studio called Argonaut. This group of young programmers would impress the Japanese video game giant by pulling off hardware tricks Nintendo themselves thought to be impossible. This is the history of how one of gaming's most popular and enduring franchises was born out of a desire to push Nintendo hardware to its absolute limits. This is the history of Nintendo advancing that franchise further by partnering with both up-and-coming and veteran developers. This is the history of Starfox. These days, true 3D graphics using polygons are a given in most modern gaming. In the 70s, 80s, and early 90s, however, sprite graphics ruled the day. Sprites worked well with games like platformers, shooters, beat-em-ups, and titles that were intended to be viewed as if the events were unfolding on a stage before an audience. 3D graphics, on the other hand, made other types of games like flight simulations and racing titles more immersive and realistic. Take Square's 1987 game Highway Star for the Famicom, also known as Rad Racer on the NES, for example. Racing games with sprite graphics had, until this point, done their best to simulate 3 dimensions, with sections of track that seemed to curve to the right or left before snapping back to a straightaway. Roadside signs and palm trees whizzing by helped sell the effect, but it was a far cry from the dream of bringing true 3D gaming into the home. Square attempted to up the ante a little more by adding an anaglyph 3D mode in Rad Racer and included a pair of 3D red and blue lens glasses with every copy. Highway Star also made use of the Japan-exclusive Famicom 3D system, a set of 3D glasses that could display stereoscopic 3D images when plugged into the Famicom. Square weren't the only ones experimenting with rudimentary 3D to make games more immersive, though. Sega had a similar device for its Sega Mark III console, better known as the Master System in the West, called the Segascope 3D glasses. These devices inched toward 3D by creating the illusion of depth, but they did little to change the actual gameplay. That would require some additional hardware. In contrast to Rad Racer's track that snapped back into place when you completed a turn, making a sharp turn in F-Zero on the Super NES seemed to rotate the entire world to follow the trajectory of the vehicle. A special graphics mode built into the Super NES called Mode 7 allowed a flat background layer to rotate and scale. The resulting 3D effect was perfect for games like F-Zero and Super Mario Kart, or even to display the overworld in RPGs like Final Fantasy VI. Mode 7 was not without its limitations, however. For starters, the graphic layer always remained flat. Any objects that should look to be rising above the ground would instead appear to be printed directly onto it. Additionally, the hovercar sprites in F-Zero didn't actually grow or shrink depending on position. Like Rad Racer before it, F-Zero used multiple sprites that popped in and out to create the illusion of depth for the player. A smaller sprite was used if a hover car was farther away. As the player approached the racer in front of them, the sprite was replaced with a larger, more detailed version. This meant that every vehicle in F-Zero required a bank of sprites to accommodate every perceived distance and angle. All of those sprites added up to a hefty memory requirement for a cartridge with an already limited capacity. While even the most advanced home consoles struggled with true 3D in the living room, three-dimensional graphics were commonplace in the arcade. In 1980, Atari released Battlezone for both their home console, the Atari Video Computer System, also known as the Atari 2600, and as a proper arcade machine. Both games put players behind the controls of a tank rumbling across a battlefield, blasting enemies to bits. The home console version had basic sprite graphics, meaning enemies popped in and out depending on the player's perceived distance, just like the hover car sprites in F-Zero. Meanwhile, the arcade version of Battlezone used vector graphics that more realistically increased and decreased in size as the player rumbled toward them to line up a shot. This vector-based graphic technology established Battlezone as the first true 3D arcade game with a first-person perspective. Similar wireframe graphics were used 3 years later in Atari's Star Wars arcade game. Where Battlezone required players to turn and drive their tanks around the battlefield, Star Wars emphasized targeting and shooting with all of the flying handled automatically by the game itself. This style of gameplay, where players needed to shoot down enemies while avoiding hazards on a preset route, came to be known as an on-rails shooter, or simply rail shooter. Atari's Star Wars arcade game caught the attention of London-based teenage programmer Jeremy Elliott San, better known to the gaming community as simply Jez San. Inspired by it, he began work on his own game that would put him on the map, a free-roaming 3D shooter called Starglider. In his mid-teens, San had dropped out of high school to pursue work in programming and game development. He quickly made a name for himself by learning how to code in assembly for numerous microprocessors, including the Tandy TRS-80 and the BBC Micro. San rapidly learned that potential clients found it difficult to take a 16-year-old programmer seriously, so he decided to start his own company. But what to call his fledgling business? His own name provided the inspiration for the word Argonaut, as in Jez San and the Argonauts, a nod to the 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts. The name became official when Argonaut Software was established in September of 1982. As soon as he printed business cards, the work started rolling in. The first game credited to Argonaut Software was 1984's Skyline Attack for the Commodore 64. The game was a 2D shooter, not unlike Defender, that tasked players with shooting down aliens over realistic skylines from various major cities like Paris and London. For Argonaut's second game, San originally wanted to license Atari's Star Wars arcade game and bring it to the home computer market in all of its 3D glory. Unable to secure the license though, San pivoted to a game heavily inspired by the first-person perspective and colorful wireframe graphics he had enjoyed through numerous Death Star trench runs in Atari's coin-op. This game would end up becoming Starglider, a free-roaming 3D shooter which launched for various computer platforms in 1986. Star Wars had been an on-rails shooter where piloting was left up to the game so that the player could focus solely on shooting. Starglider, on the other hand, gave the player manual control to chart their own course, flying above a battlefield teeming with enemy targets. 2 years later, 1988's Starglider 2 improved on its predecessor's 3D visuals by replacing the wireframe graphics of the original with flat-shaded polygons. Its gameplay evolved as well, becoming a bit more complex. It was on Starglider 2 and its various ports that two future game industry heavyweights got their start. Two teenagers named Giles Goddard and Dylan Cuthbert had held keen interests in computer programming and game development. Both were doing programming on their home computers that their school teachers couldn't fathom, let alone help them with. So, like Jez San had done before them, both Goddard and Cuthbert dropped out of school to work at Argonaut, which consisted of just half a dozen programmers holed up in San's house at that point. Goddard spent those early days porting Starglider 2 to the Apple Macintosh, while Cuthbert focused on sound programming for the Spectrum and Amiga versions of the game. The team at Argonaut had an insatiable curiosity for experimenting with 3D graphics on up-and-coming platforms. After Starglider 2's completion, Cuthbert was put to the task of developing a tech demo for an up-and-coming British video game console being developed in partnership between the computer peripheral company Konix and Flare Technology, a trio of engineers formerly of Sinclair Research, the company that created the ZX Spectrum. The Konix multi-system was intended to blow the Commodore, Amiga, and Atari ST out of the water with more powerful hardware and a host of peripherals like a light gun with force feedback, a steering wheel, a flight yoke, foot pedals, and even a motorized chair to recreate the immersion of sit-down arcade cabinets like Sega's Afterburner. Ultimately, Konix ran out of funds and folded before the multi-system ever saw a release. After the cancellation, Flare Technologies' Martin Brennan and John Matheson went on to design two consoles for Atari, the unreleased 32-bit Atari Panther and the 64-bit Atari Jaguar. As for Flare Technologies' third engineer, Ben Cheese, he would soon receive a phone call that would provide him with an opportunity to leave his mark on gaming forever. With the Konix multi-system relegated to the scrap heap of history, Argonaut refocused their efforts on other machines like Nintendo's NES and Game Boy. Atari dominated what little console market there was in the UK at the time, with most people playing video games on home computers. Still, Argonaut got their hands on an NES and developed a Starglider-like demo that ran at a poor frame rate, but proved wireframe graphics were possible on Nintendo's console hardware. But what about Nintendo's portable hardware? Jez San set Dylan Cuthbert to the task of creating a 3D game on the Game Boy, a task that began with reverse engineering a consumer Game Boy to create a makeshift development kit. Argonaut was much too small and unknown to get a real dev kit, so Cuthbert pieced together his own that involved a camera pointed at his Game Boy screen and a severely modified copy of Tetris with wires connected to a custom circuit board that another employee at Argonaut custom printed in a bathtub full of acid. With his makeshift dev kit complete, Cuthbert got to work developing a 3D graphics engine on the Game Boy and began to labor away on a game Argonaut was calling Eclipse at the time. Cuthbert took cues from the success of Starglider and its sequel, designing Eclipse to be a 360-degree free-controlling shooter. Cuthbert didn't know it, but San packed an early version of Eclipse when he journeyed to America for the 1990 Summer Consumer Electronics Show. It didn't take him long to get it in front of Nintendo of America's Don James. These days, James acts as the Executive Vice President of Operations at Nintendo's American branch. But back in 1990, he was in charge of Nintendo of America's Special Projects division. Cuthbert's demo completely blew James's mind. It had been widely believed throughout Nintendo that 3D graphics on the Game Boy were an impossibility. At the time, Shigeru Miyamoto and his team were already struggling with 3D on the far more advanced Super Famicom. So to see true 3D wireframe graphics running on Nintendo's underpowered handheld was nothing short of miraculous. Additionally, Cuthbert was able to bypass the Game Boy's copyright protection, intended to prevent third parties from manufacturing Game Boy games without seeking permission from Nintendo first. For a Game Boy to work, the word Nintendo had to drop down when the system was turned on. Thus, third parties would be using Nintendo's trademark without permission for their games to function, putting themselves further in legal trouble. Argonaut had figured a way around that protection though, replacing the Nintendo text with Argonaut on their demo, which operated normally. James shared both miracles with other staff members at Nintendo, and in July of 1990, Dylan Cuthbert and Jez San, at ages 18 and 23 respectively, found themselves seated in an airplane bound for Kyoto for a week of meetings with some of the brightest game makers at Nintendo. In the initial meeting, the two programmers from London met with around 30 Nintendo employees, each wearing Nintendo-branded jackets, eager to meet the people who had made 3D graphics possible on the Game Boy. San and Cuthbert demonstrated Argonaut's work on the Nintendo Entertainment System as well as the Game Boy, much to the amazement of Nintendo's top brass. At the time, Eclipse was already licensed to UK-based publisher Mindscape, but Nintendo bought up all the rights to Cuthbert's unfinished game and invited him and some of Argonaut's other young programmers to partner with Nintendo R&D 1 to finish the title. Nintendo had a few surprises of their own to share with the young programmers from London. They introduced San and Cuthbert to the upcoming 16-bit Super Famicom, and 3 titles currently in various states of completion that Nintendo planned to have available at launch: Super Mario World, F-Zero, and Pilot Wings. Nintendo explained that they wanted the plane and Pilot Wings to rotate in full 3D, but that it was not possible with the stock Super Famicom hardware. They included a DSP chip in each copy of Pilot Wings that could handle the complex mathematical calculations necessary for the pseudo 3D perspective, but it wasn't quite powerful enough for true 3D, let alone shaded polygons. San suggested that Argonaut could design a chip that would make 3D graphics possible on the Super Famicom hardware. At first, Nintendo wanted to include the chip in their 16-bit hardware itself, standardizing what would become known as the Super Effects chip in the North American launch of the Super NES and subsequent versions of the Super Famicom. Time, however, rendered this idea an impossibility, as the wheels of the Super NES's North American launch were already well in motion. San suggested that the chip could be added to the Super Famicom cartridges instead, assuming it would actually work. To verify that his grandiose plan was at least possible, San pressed pause on the meeting at Nintendo to make an extremely important international phone call. Nintendo's top brass were waiting in the room when San rang up Ben Cheese, who had worked extensively on the hardware for the ill-fated Conix multisystem. The two agreed that not only was it possible to pack a coprocessor into a Super NES cartridge, but that it would also make true 3D graphics possible on Nintendo's upcoming 16-bit console. Yamauchi, Nintendo's president at the time, asked San how much money he'd need to develop such a chip. San responded with the largest, most inconceivable number he could think of: $2 million, equating to more than $4.5 million when adjusted for inflation in 2022. To San's surprise, Yamauchi granted the seemingly impossible sum without hesitation, leading San to think he potentially could have gotten away with an even larger number. Argonaut's agreement with Nintendo was set. The $2 million would fund the development of the specialized chip, and additionally, Argonaut would develop 3 Super NES titles that utilized it. The Kyoto meetings ended with unprecedented results. Nintendo agreed to partner with a Western developer to help develop new games together in Nintendo's Kyoto headquarters for the first time ever. This astonishing partnership would polish up Cuthbert's Eclipse for the Game Boy, put Argonaut on the map internationally, and launch a series that would become one of Nintendo's core franchises for decades to come. Compared to the other handhelds on the market at the time, the Game Boy felt conservative with its 4 shades of gray-green and graphically limited titles. The Atari Lynx, the Sega Game Gear, and the NEC PC Engine GT all featured full-color graphics and provided gameplay experiences more in line with home consoles. Now, thanks to the programming talents of a teenager from London and a dev kit Frankensteined together with a custom circuit board printed in a bathtub full of acid, the humble Game Boy would soon boast something its competitors could not: a game with true 3D graphics. To finish development on Eclipse, Cuthbert and team were assigned to Nintendo R&D 1, the same team led by Game Boy inventor and creative luminary Gunpei Yokoi. During development, Cuthbert would travel back and forth between London and Kyoto so that he could continue collaborating with Nintendo's R&D 1 staff. Directorial duties were handled by Yoshio Sakamoto, who had worked on several standout Famicom titles, including the original Metroid, Kid Icarus, and Famicom Detective Club. It was Sakamoto who received one of Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi's infamous sudden calls in the wee hours one morning with a simple and straightforward directive: Eclipse would be renamed simply X. The soundtrack of the game was the debut work of Kazumi Totaka, who would gain fame for his composition and sound design work on numerous Nintendo games, from Super Mario Land 2 6 Golden Coins on the Game Boy to Animal Crossing New Horizons on the Nintendo Switch. Though previously thought to have originated in Mario Paint, his infamous Totaka song first appeared in X. The 19-note melody would continue to be included in several of the games Totaka worked on in the future as an ongoing Easter egg. X placed players behind the controls of a starship. They were tasked with carrying out 10 missions assigned by the training academy coach to protect the planet Tetamus II from an alien invasion. By the time Cuthbert began collaborating with Nintendo R&D 1, the bulk of X's design was largely finished. Sakamoto helped polish the game by adding and changing details to make it easier for the player to understand what to do and where to go. The result was a fairly choppy but undeniably impressive three-dimensional title unlike anything anyone had ever seen on a Game Boy. In addition to the in-game 3D graphics and gameplay, X featured a fully 3D title screen and tiny movies in which the vector-based training academy coach would explain mission objectives. X launched to middling reviews on the Japanese market, with publications like Famitsu chiding the game's difficulty and complexity, but applauding its seemingly miraculous 3D graphics. The sheer spectacle of a three-dimensional game running on Nintendo's portable hardware was sadly not enough to garner X a Western release. The game was fully localized for the West and even given a new title, Lunar Chase, but Nintendo of America ultimately scrapped its release out of concerns that the complexity of the title would be a bit too much for an audience more accustomed to simple puzzle games like Tetris. While development progressed on X, Argonaut moved quickly to make good on designing a chip to bring 3D graphics to the Super Famicom. San enlisted the aid of Ben Cheese and a few other hardware engineers to design what would first be known as the Mario chip, before Nintendo's marketing team dubbed it the Super FX chip. In this case, Mario stood for Mathematical Argonaut Rotational Input-Output. Argonaut was on the hook to make 3 Super FX chip games for Nintendo. To facilitate development of all 3 games, Dylan Cuthbert properly relocated to Kyoto along with Argonaut employees Giles Goddard, Krister Wamble, and later Colin Reed, setting up shop inside Nintendo's offices and reporting directly to Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto. By the time they arrived in Kyoto, the Argonaut team had a working demo full of 3D rendered objects and gameplay similar to Star Glider 2. The player could fly a craft where they pleased with full 360-degree movement, but it was a far cry from a finished game, and Miyamoto knew it was in rough shape. He instructed the Argonaut team to start over with a simple shape standing in for what would eventually become the player's ship. Miyamoto also chose to ditch the free-flying gameplay for an on-rails experience. This idea came from the Fushimi Inari Shrine in southern Kyoto and its thousands of bright red torii gates. Miyamoto visited this shrine often, and his decision to go for an on-rails experience occurred to him as he imagined piloting a ship through the makeshift corridors formed by the torii gates. This on-rails focus would allow players to navigate a series of obstacle courses and enemy encounters before reaching a boss at the end of each level. Once these changes were incorporated and working well, development on the game that would eventually become Starfox truly began. With Argonaut focused on programming the game, the Nintendo team set to work creating its setting and plot, eventually deciding to name it Starfox. The story saw the Lilat system besieged by the military might of the evil Emperor Andros. To counter the invasion, General Pepper of the planet Corneria entrusted a squadron of advanced aircraft called R-Wings to a band of adventure-seeking mercenaries with incomparable aerial combat skill, the Starfox team. Miyamoto wanted nothing to do with the serious human-based science fiction storylines full of mecha and monsters that were common in Japanese pop culture at the time. Instead, he asked a young Takaya Imamura, who had just wrapped up character designs for F-Zero, to create a cast of anthropomorphic animals for Starfox. Imamura felt animals would be a strange cast for a shooter, but Miyamoto persisted, claiming that an all-animal cast would leave a stronger impact than a human one. Several design ideas for Starfox came directly from Japanese culture. The entire background story for the galactic conflict between Hound Dog General Pepper and his forces and the wicked ape scientist Andros came from the Japanese idiom kene no naka, which meant the relations between dogs and monkeys. The meaning is much the same as the English expression fighting like cats and dogs, only in Japan, dogs and cats tend to get along, while dogs and monkeys are surprisingly mortal enemies. The Fushimi Inari shrine that inspired Miyamoto's decision to build the game as an on-rails shooter also inspired the game's protagonist, Fox McCloud. The Shinto god of rice, Inari, is said to use foxes as messengers, and so the shrine is home to numerous statues of foxes. For the rest of the cast, Imamura looked to Japanese folklore and settled on a hare and a pheasant. He drew the characters' personalities directly from his Nintendo colleagues working on the Star Fox project. Project leader Miyamoto inspired the Star Fox team leader Fox McCloud. Tsuyoshi Watanabe, who designed 3D objects for the game including the R-Wing ships, along with enemies and obstacles, became the basis for Fox's rival and second-in-command, Falco Lombardi, the pheasant. Star Fox director Katsuya Eguchi became the wise team mentor Peppy Hare, and Yoichi Yamada, responsible for the game's enemy animations, became Slippy Toad due to his habit of signing notes to fellow employees with a small toad mascot. In addition to creating the game's characters, Imamura would be in charge of designing everything that would be displayed in traditional sprite art. In these early days, it would have been impossible for Imamura to suspect what long-lasting impact he'd leave on not just the Star Fox franchise, but several of Nintendo's most popular series over the course of his 30 years at the company. Rounding out the Nintendo talent assigned to the Star Fox project were Koji Kondo and Hajime Hirasawa. Kondo, who by this time had built a name for himself by composing for The Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Series, lent his talents for sound design to the project. Kondo incorporated effects to make it sound like massive battleships were passing overhead in some of the boss battles, and increased the reverb during certain sections like flying through a corridor to make them extra immersive. Surprisingly, Kondo did not compose the project's score, with the job instead falling to Hajime Hirasawa, with this being his third and final project at Nintendo. For Star Fox, Hirasawa composed a soundtrack that incorporated multiple musical styles, ranging from the rock-heavy melodies of Corneria and the funk-driven bass lines of Fortuna, to the synth-heavy sounds of Macbeth and the title's cinematic-inspired main theme. While the Nintendo team focused largely on the creative aspects of the game, the Argonaut team developed levels and gameplay concepts. Miyamoto would sit behind the young programmers smoking cigarettes and making suggestions over their shoulders. Dylan Cuthbert and Takaya Imamura cited Namco's 3D shooters Solvalu and Starblade as direct influences on Star Fox's development. Both were popular in Japanese arcades at the time and featured on-rails gameplay and shaded polygon graphics. Star Fox's Armada level was even a not-so-subtle nod to Starblade, as were enemies briefly flashing when hit, which was a detail pulled directly from the game. What set Star Fox apart from Namco's 3D shooters, though, was an emphasis on the feeling of flight. The on-rails nature of Star Fox meant that players had to maneuver the R-Wing to avoid incoming enemy projectiles and other obstructions. The R-Wing could boost forward or slow down to avoid being crushed by falling obstacles, and the L and R buttons on the Super NES gamepad could roll the R-Wing 90 degrees to fit through narrow gaps with a more vertical orientation. Double-tapping either of these shoulder buttons would perform the game's famous barrel roll action that blocked incoming enemy blasts. Star Fox also incorporated numerous power-ups. Destructive Nova Bombs wiped out most enemies on the screen and did severe damage to bosses. A power shield rendered the R-Wing invincible to enemy attacks or collisions for a number of free hits, and the Twin Blasters power-up allowed the player's ship to fire off 2 laser blasts per shot instead of 1. Collecting this power-up a second time would improve their destructive power. Another of the game's unique mechanics was Fox's interaction with his wingmen. Peppy, Slippy, and even the ace pilot Falco occasionally ran into trouble and radioed Fox for an assist. They'd respond with thanks if the player helped them out, but if they were ignored, they could be damaged or even shot down. By early 1993, Star Fox was complete and ready for a launch date of February 21st in Japan and March 26th in North America. The PAL version would be released in the summer of 1993 under the name Starwing to prevent confusion and potential legal action from a now defunct German company called Starvox. Nintendo would put $15 million behind marketing StarFox and the Super FX chip that powered it. Cuthbert even created a special competition version of StarFox with modified versions of the Corneria and Asteroid stages and its own scoring system, which were used during a promotional event called the Super StarFox Weekend Competition. The event took place at an estimated 2,000 stores across North America from April 30th to May 2nd, 1993. Competitors who racked up the most points for their location would enter a randomized drawing to win either a vacation to various international cities like Paris or Tokyo, or a lump sum of $15,000. Similar competitions for Starwing were also held across Europe and the United Kingdom. StarFox flew off store shelves, selling 1.7 million copies in North America and Japan by the end of March 1993, and an estimated 4 million copies worldwide by 1998. The game's success meant the pressure was on to bring Fox and his squad back for a sequel, and fast. The Super FX chip had brought true 3D graphics to the Super NES in a way Nintendo hadn't thought possible. But the world of game development was moving fast, and nothing stayed on the cutting edge for long. Argonaut and Nintendo knew that the window for developing and selling Super FX games was short and closing. Nintendo's bitter rival Sega was preparing to bring ports of its Virtua series of arcade titles, each featuring 3D polygonal graphics, to the home market on the Mega Drive or Genesis, its 32X add-on, and their upcoming next-gen system, the Sega Saturn. Meanwhile, Sony was preparing to enter the video game industry with a console of their own called the PlayStation. Both the Saturn and PlayStation were 32-bit consoles with 3D graphic capabilities that simply outmatched what the Super NES could produce, even with the Super FX chip. With Star Fox complete, Argonaut had 2 additional games they would need to create to fulfill their contract with Nintendo and release them hopefully before their competitors' impending new consoles launched. To expedite the development process, Giles Goddard and Dylan Cuthbert split up, each taking the lead on 2 separate projects. Goddard already had experience making racing games in the past, and would focus on creating a cartoony racing title called Wild Tracks in Japan and Stunt Race Effects in the West. Cuthbert, however, would continue to work with the Star Fox team on creating a sequel. Development on this second title, simply named Star Fox 2, began before the first game even hit store shelves. The team was happy with the work they'd done creating Star Fox, but they also knew there was plenty of potential to expand on its gameplay and concepts. The story saw the tyrannical Andross re-emerge after his defeat in the first game, determined once again to conquer the Lylat system. The 4 main Star Fox team members would return, but would also be joined by 2 new female recruits, a cat named Miu and a dog named Faye. While the first game had been a fairly linear experience, with players simply selecting the course they would travel at the start of the game based on the difficulty they wanted to challenge, Star Fox 2 completely removed that linearity by introducing a map screen where players would need to make strategic decisions about which threats to send Fox and his friends after, and in what order. This time, Andross would launch a multi-pronged attack on Corneria and the rest of the planets in the Lylat system, which Fox's team would need to contend with, including missiles to intercept, bases to liberate, and enemy fighters to engage. It was up to players to carefully position 2 pilots from Team Star Fox around the map to counter Andross and his minions without endangering their homeworld. Ignoring an incoming missile to tackle one of the captured bases would leave Corneria vulnerable and inch the player ever closer to a game over. This new strategic focus for Star Fox 2 was only one of the changes that made this game radically different from its predecessor. While its stages still had on-rails segments that scrolled in one direction, several levels featured a free-flying 360-degree all-range mode, more in line with Argonaut's original intent for the first game. Some ground-based stages required the Arwing to transform into a mech walker to invade bases and even engage in some light platforming, such as stepping on buttons to open doors and hopping over hazards. Certain encounters, like engaging a missile in deep space, were extremely short and might only take a few seconds for a skilled player. Additional Arwing models were also added for the Starfox crew to pilot, adding more gameplay variety. These ranged from the ultra-nimble light Arwing piloted by Miyu and Faye to the slower, more powerful armored Arwing for Slippy and Peppy, and the balanced prototype Arwing manned by Fox and Falco. Each ship also came equipped with a charge shot that would do massive damage and could even home in on enemies once certain conditions were met in-game. All of this firepower would be necessary to engage a new, more lethal enemy, the Star Wolf Squadron, led by Wolf O'Donnell. Encounters with the Star Wolf team on the map would result in spectacular space dogfights, complete with taunts from Wolf and the rest of his team. Development of the original Super Effects chip was hampered a bit by a rushed schedule, preparing it for the first Starfox game. But as Cuthbert and the team continued working on the title, Argonaut had been laboring away at refining their new chip. They would eventually develop a second revision of it called the Super Effects GSU, standing for Graphics Support Unit, which gave Star Fox 2 the extra power it needed to improve on its predecessor. With a host of new gameplay features and a freshly revised Super Effects chip to help power them, Star Fox 2 was accelerating toward a release, when suddenly Nintendo presented an abrupt course change. The game was going to be cancelled. According to Cuthbert, Star Fox 2 was completed in time for its August 1995 launch window, but the game was held because Miyamoto wanted a clean break between 3D games on the Super NES and 3D games on the company's upcoming Nintendo 64 console. However, that decision was made when the Nintendo 64 was intended to launch in December of 1995. In reality, the N64 launch was delayed multiple times. First, from December of 1995 to April of 1996, and then once more from April to June of 1996 in Japan. North America wouldn't see the N64 until September of that year, and other regions wouldn't get Nintendo's new console until March of 1997. Had Star Fox 2 been released as intended, it could have been on the market for the better part of a year to a year and a half before Nintendo's new console finally made it to store shelves. Star Fox 2 may have been cancelled, but it wouldn't be lost to time. It would take 22 years, though, for the game to resurface in an official capacity, first on the Super NES Classic in 2017, and then later on Nintendo Switch Online. Other games that utilized the Super Effects chip did see releases late in the life cycle of the Super NES, though. Nintendo's own Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, took advantage of the chip's ability to scale and stretch boss enemies, as well as incorporate other special effects. And without the Super Effects chip, the Super NES port of Doom would not have been possible. The cancellation of Star Fox 2 marked the end of Argonaut Games' involvement with the series and the conclusion of their exclusivity contract with Nintendo. Argonaut would pitch Nintendo a demo for a 3D action platformer featuring Yoshi from Super Mario World, but Nintendo passed, effectively ending their partnership with the company and leaving San and his team to pivot towards developing the game as an original IP. Ultimately, the demo would become Croc: Legend of the Gobos and released in 1997. By that time, though, Nintendo had already set the standard for what a 3D platformer should be, with Super Mario 64 released in June of 1996 for their Nintendo 64. Giles Goddard would stay on with Nintendo, continuing to push the envelope with 3D graphics. Goddard's experiments with motion tracking, for example, resulted in the stretchable Mario face at the title screen of Super Mario 64. Impressed by the graphics achieved in titles such as Ridge Racer for the original PlayStation, Cuthbert left Argonaut and Japan to take a job with Sony Computer Entertainment in the US. Star Fox 2 would not be Cuthbert's last Star Fox project, but it would be for the foreseeable future. Even with the game being cancelled by Nintendo, rumblings of a new entry in the series began to grow louder. This time for a console built from the ground up to handle 3D polygonal graphics with ease. The Nintendo 64. With Star Fox 2, Nintendo intended to push the series forward with gameplay that emphasized strategy, platforming, and the ability to freely explore in a 3D space. On the N64 though, Nintendo would instead attempt to remake and perfect the original Super NES Star Fox. Everything about this new version of Star Fox would be bigger and better, showcasing the stark difference between 3D games on the Super NES and what was possible on Nintendo's new 64-bit hardware. Demonstrating that difference would be critical not only to impress the Nintendo faithful, but also to compete with industry rivals Sony and Sega in the marketplace. Sony's PlayStation and Sega's Saturn took advantage of the additional memory storage available on CD-based media, filling their games with impressive full-motion video sequences to help tell stories and CD-quality sound to tantalize the ears. Memory space was limited on Nintendo 64 cartridges, meaning that pre-rendered videos and high-quality audio were either highly compressed or dropped entirely. Memory limitations aside, Nintendo also differed from their competition philosophically on in-game cinematics, with Miyamoto going so far as to say that games that aspired to be more like interactive movies often wound up more movie than game. For Star Fox 64, Miyamoto and Nintendo's Entertainment Analysis and Development Team, more commonly known as Nintendo EAD, would craft a game that felt cinematic through its interactivity, not through pre-rendered cutscenes or video sequences. Work on the game that would become Star Fox 64, or Lylat Wars in Europe, began with experiments and demos crafted by a two-person team. Takaya Imamura brought his creative eye to the project, while Kazuaki Morita provided programming expertise. The duo had previously combined their efforts to create several of the bosses in The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past on the Super NES. Much like Nintendo evolved the formulas for the Legend of Zelda and Metroid series with their Super NES counterparts, development of Star Fox 64 focused on perfecting the formula established in the original game, rather than recreating the wheel. Even as more people joined the project, Imamura continued to work on several aspects of the game, including modeling characters, developing gameplay ideas, giving instruction to the composers on the type of music he wanted, and overhauling the Star Fox storyline. The game's plot saw the Lylat system once again threatened when General Pepper detected strange readings coming from the planet Venom. Pepper sent Team Star Fox to investigate, but this was not the four-member team from the original game. Star Fox 64 retconned the previous story and now featured Fox's father, James McCloud, Peppy Hare, and Pigma Dengar as the original Team Star Fox. On Venom, Pigma betrayed his comrades, allowing Andross's forces to capture James and Peppy. Peppy eventually managed to escape and share the story with a young Fox McCloud. 5 years later, James is presumed dead, and Andross would once again invade the Lylat system. To thwart Andross, General Pepper called upon a new Star Fox team: ace pilot Falco Lombardi, team mentor Peppy Hare, mechanic Slippy Toad, and James's son, Fox, following in his father's footsteps as team leader. To ramp up the drama, Star Fox 64 featured full voice acting. Everything from pilot interactions, mission briefings, and even a narrated introduction at the start of the game now included voiced dialogue. Writer Mitsuhiro Takano aimed to craft lines that felt like they could have been pulled from a movie, like Peppy advising the player to
"Never give up! Trust your instincts!"
and Andross taunting Fox with
"It's foolish to come against me!"
And of course, everyone's favorite Star Fox meme,
"Do a barrel roll!"
While the audio samples used were more compressed than the CD quality audio possible on the PlayStation, the lower quality made sense in context as radio chatter coming directly from the R-Wing. Voice acting was a new concept in a game largely built from the bones of its predecessors. According to Shigeru Miyamoto, 60% of the ideas for Star Fox 64 came directly from Star Fox 1, with 30% recycled from the ill-fated Star Fox 2. The on-rails gameplay, the power-ups, as well as several stage, enemy, and boss designs from the first game would all return for Star Fox 64. Nintendo also kept several ideas from the unreleased Star Fox 2. An all-range mode that allowed players to freely fly where they wanted, the Charge Shot, and Team Star Fox's rival squadron, Starwolf, all debuted in Star Fox 64 despite being developed for the cancelled Super NES sequel. The remaining 10% of the game would be made up of new concepts or reinventions of previous ones. One example was Star Fox 64's multiplayer mode, which allowed up to 4 people to battle it out with R-Wings, Landmaster tanks, or even running around on foot. Just like in the original game, Fox's wingman could be shot down, but Star Fox 64 made a wingman's loss feel more impactful, as each pilot had a special ability that would aid Fox in his fight against Andross. As the team veteran, Peppy would act as an in-game tutorial, offering helpful advice for navigating the game's levels and conquering its numerous foes. Slippy would analyze boss enemies and show their health as part of the heads-up display. Falco would help lead the player to alternative routes throughout the Lilat system, opening pathways to planets that would be inaccessible otherwise. This was essential for accessing all of the game's missions. Losing your wingman meant losing helpful tools, giving players extra incentive to come to their aid should they be caught in enemy crosshairs. To keep gameplay fresh, Nintendo EAD developed new vehicles for Fox to pilot. Originally, Miyamoto wanted the R-Wing to transform into a humanoid mech similar to the Walker from Star Fox 2, but the rest of the team pushed back on the idea. Instead, they developed the ground-based Landmaster tank and an experimental submersible called the Blue Marine. The Landmaster could briefly hover to jump over debris or roll to the side to avoid obstacles, all while pulling off charge shots and boosting forward just like the R-Wing. The Blue Marine, on the other hand, could fire homing light bomb torpedoes that would illuminate the dark aquatic depths. Nintendo attempted to up the immersion of Star Fox 64 in as many ways as possible, with improved storytelling, countless lines of fully voiced dialogue, and plenty of new gameplay features. Its most immersive aspect, however, wouldn't be found in the game itself, but instead within the box it came in. Star Fox 64 was the first game to ship with the Rumble Pack, a battery-powered peripheral that clicked into the Nintendo 64 controller's memory card slot and punctuated every laser blast and explosion in Star Fox 64 with force feedback vibration. Long before the PlayStation 5's haptic feedback imitated the metal-on-metal friction of a gun jam in Deathloop, and more than a year before Psycho Mantis vibrated a DualShock with the power of his mind in Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1, Nintendo's innovative Rumble Pack helped immerse players in the experience, with every Nova Bomb fired and enemy boss destroyed in Star Fox 64. Though incorporating the Rumble Pack into the game posed some challenges, Nintendo EAD learned they had to communicate effectively what was vibrating, or risk confusing players. As a result, several subtle vibrations were dropped in favor of more obvious ones. The game launched first in Japan in April of 1997, before making its North American arrival 2 months later, and finally landing in Europe in October. By the end of 1997, the game had sold more than 1 million copies, a success shared by only 4 other Nintendo 64 games by that point: Super Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, GoldenEye 007, and Diddy Kong Racing. Ultimately, Star Fox 64 became the 9th best-selling title on the console, with more than 4 million copies sold worldwide. Not only that, Star Fox 64 firmly cemented the characters and story beats that would directly influence the next 3 entries in the franchise. Work on the next Star Fox game for the Nintendo 64 began soon after the game hit store shelves. At the time, no one could have predicted the change in direction the series would take in its next adventure, or the rare talent required to see it through.